Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. In San Francisco, a fiery hearing on Capitol Hill still underway. We are going into the fifth hour of the CEOs of Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Facebook being questioned by the House Antitrust Subcommittee on a range of issues. The CEOs making the case that competition
We compete hard. We compete fairly. We try to be the best.
Our goal is the best, not the most. In fact, we don't have a dominant share in any market or in any product category where we do business.
Competition drives us to innovate, and it also leads to better products, lower choices, and more choices for everyone.
But lawmakers coming out swinging, the CEOs struggling to get their answers in. Jeff Bezos of Amazon in particular having trouble getting some words in edgewise. Take a listen.
If Amazon didn't have monopoly power over these sellers, do you think they would choose to stay in a relationship that is characterized by bullying, fear, and panic?
With all respect, Congresswoman, I do not accept the premise of your question.
Does Amazon pursue similar predatory campaigns in other parts of its business?
I cannot comment on that because I don't remember it.
Here's how the apparel company described working with Amazon, and I quote, "Amazon strings you along for a while because it feels so good to get that paycheck every week. And in the past, for lack of a better term, we called it Amazon heroin." Mr. Bezos, this is one of your partners. Why on earth would they compare your company to a drug dealer?
Sir, I have great respect for you in this committee, but I completely disagree with that characterization.
Still, shares of all four companies ending the day in the green and above the rest of the market. Joining us now to discuss, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, who's been watching the market moves all day. Abigail, what did you see as this hearing went on and is still going on?
Well, some pretty interesting comments there for sure, Emily. And I think that these big tech CEOs and companies, and more so the stocks, benefited probably from the fact that it was a Fed day, because I think more of Wall Street's attention was probably going to the Fed as opposed to this testimony, as fiery as it really was, as just demonstrated there. So we did have an up day, and one of the first up days in quite some time. All these stocks up more than 1%. And the reason that I say an up day for the first time in some time, if we take a look at a 5-day chart of these big four mega caps, it's been a bit of a rough patch. In fact, it's really been a rough patch, not just over the 5 days, where all of these stocks are down about 2.4%. But over the last 10 days, there's been some waffling as well. So I think that there was some anticipation that this could be an overhang. But let's face it, Emily, from the standpoint of whether or not any regulation will be slapped on big tech and big internet companies right now, it seems unlikely. The companies probably most vulnerable to that possibility would be Google and Facebook, based on some work that I saw, considering the monopoly hold in terms of Google. I think I saw 90% of the internet, Facebook, their social media. And that, interestingly, Amazon, which seemed to be under the most pressure there, at least CEO Jeff Bezos, that the case for monopoly there is less compelling when compared to Walmart on some statistics. So, again, I think that right now Wall Street is thinking that while it was a psychological overhang, that the reality is regulation is not going to happen anytime too soon.
All right, Abigail, thank you so much for that. And again, we are now in round 3 of questions with the representatives talking to the CEOs. I want to focus in on Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in particular. Take a listen to this exchange with Representative Gerald Nadler.
Mr. Zuckerberg, you have written that Facebook can likely always just buy any competitive startups. In fact, on the day Facebook bought Instagram, which you described as a threat, you wrote, quote, "One thing about startups is you can often acquire them," close quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, you were referring to companies like Instagram in that quote, weren't you?
I've always been clear that we viewed Instagram both as a competitor and as a complement to our services. In the growing space around after smartphones started getting big, and they competed with us in the space of mobile cameras and mobile photo sharing. But at the time, almost no one thought of them as a general social network. And people didn't think of them as competing with us in that space. And, I think that the acquisition has been wildly successful. We were able to by acquiring them, continue investing in it and growing it as a standalone brand that now reaches many more people than I think either Kevin, the co-founder, or I thought would be possible at the time.
In early 2012, when Facebook contemplated acquiring Instagram, a competitive startup, you told your CFO that though nascent, Instagram could be very disruptive to us. And in the weeks leading up to the deal, you described Instagram as a threat, saying that, quote, Instagram can meaningfully hurt us without becoming a huge business.
At the time, there was a small but growing field of
Did you mean that consumers might switch from Facebook to Instagram? That was my question.
Thanks, Congressman.
Yes or no? Did you mean that?
In the space of mobile photos and camera apps, which was growing, they were a competitor. I've been clear about that. I've been clear that Instagram was a competitor in the space of mobile photo sharing. And by having them join us, they certainly went from being a competitor in the space of being a mobile camera to an app that we could help grow.
Mergers and acquisitions that buy off potential competitive threats violate the antitrust laws. In your own words, you purchased Instagram to neutralize a competitive threat. If this was an illegal merger at the time of the transaction, why shouldn't Instagram now be broken off into a separate company?
I think the FTC had all of these documents and reviewed this and unanimously voted at the time not to challenge the acquisition. The acquisition has done wildly well, largely because not just of the founders' talent, but because we invested heavily in building up the infrastructure and promoting it and working on security and working on a lot of things around this. And I think that this has been an American success story.
Well, thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, you're making my point. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to end where I began. Facebook, by Mr. Zuckerberg's own admission and by the documents we have from the time, Facebook saw Instagram as a threat that could potentially siphon business away from Facebook. And so rather than compete with it, Facebook bought it. This is exactly the type of anti-competitive acquisition that the antitrust laws were designed to prevent. This should never have happened in the first place. It should never have been permitted to happen, and it cannot happen again.
Our next guest has some strong opinions on this. Joining us now, Roger McNamee, an early Facebook investor and also the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Roger, obviously, I know you have some thoughts on this. Facebook has made the case time and again that Instagram was much smaller than it is today when they bought it so many years ago. What was your take on that exchange? Clearly, the House obtained documents that showed that Zuckerberg was scared of Instagram taking users from Facebook.
Emily, I think the thing that's most fascinating about that exchange is exactly what you said. The antitrust subcommittee has a lot of documentation. They have, I think, 1.3 million documents, lots and lots of internal communications. So for any company that has Slack, you should keep this clearly in mind, because each of these companies has their own software that works the way Slack does. And it leads to a very informal style of communications. And inevitably, there will be things on there that look terrible in hearing. And it strikes me that both Facebook and Amazon came off particularly badly in that regard, because there was evidence brought forward that suggested explicit violations of antitrust law relative to mergers. And in that context, I think this hearing is qualitatively different from any of the ones that have taken place with Silicon Valley executives to this point, because this is part of a very long investigation that is not done. And yet they clearly were unbelievably well prepared. And they have a lot of data. The data, even on the narrowest definition of antitrust, suggests that there are real issues that these companies may not be able to evade. And the market can, I think, correctly imagine that it's going to take time for all this to work through. But I think that regulation is not only inevitable, I think what you heard today is an openness to thinking about antitrust more broadly than it has been thought of in recent years, and to recognize that internet platforms require something more than antitrust, that they need to be, addressed relative to the safety of the products they create and freedom from bias, but also the privacy issues. And all of that collectively, I think, is on the table now in a way that was not imaginable a year ago.
We're still listening into this hearing, still underway. We're going to the fifth hour of it, the third round of questioning, Roger. Certainly, the CEOs struggled more than they have in previous hearings. This was Jeff Bezos' first time testifying before Congress. If you could give each of them a grade, what would it be?
Well, it's a great question. I haven't thought about it that way because I think they came into the hearing with a very clear framework. In their own worldview, what they're doing is incredibly positive. And if you look at this from a customer point of view or a shareholder point of view, these companies have been some of the greatest in the history of American business. I think in the context of the pandemic, the economic contraction, and George Floyd, the country has stepped back, and things that were acceptable because the economy continued to grow suddenly don't look acceptable in the context of an economy that's contracting rapidly. And we look at the George Floyd murder differently than we looked at similar murders in the past. And I think that's because of the context of the pandemic and the economic contraction. And with all of that, I think that these companies, I think they played the game they intended to play. And I think they were maybe not expecting Congress to come in, one, with the level of preparation it brought in, for which there was really nothing they could do. And then secondly, with this, openness on both sides. Remember, there were Republicans who participated in this as well. An openness to thinking about regulation as something that is just good for the economy. I mean, tech investors have forgotten the incredibly important role antitrust has historically played in unleashing growth in the U.S. It started in 1956 when AT&T signed a consent decree that restricted it to the telephone business, which is why there's an independent computer industry in the U.S. But it also was forced to take the transistor and make it available to anyone, which literally created Silicon Valley. And then subsequent cases led to the creation of an independent software industry, to the creation of personal computers as an industry, data communications, the internet itself, and then, of course, the Google Facebook era enabled by the Microsoft case. And so I think as investors, we should look at antitrust as a pro-growth thing.
We're watching Representative Nick Gusay questioning Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos at this very moment. What did you make of Jeff Bezos's showing here? He didn't get asked a question for more than an hour. I was wondering if he was taking a break or something. There was a viral video of him eating a snack while his colleagues and his peers were getting grilled. But lawmakers certainly stepped up, and there were a number of times that Bezos couldn't get a word in edgewise. What did you think?
Well, so I thought Jeff's opening statement was really remarkable, and I suspect he wrote it himself. It was very personal, it was very thoughtful, and it laid out his personal philosophy really well. I think the issue we're talking about here is not whether these companies did something wrong, although I think in some cases they did do things that were wrong, but rather there is a reassessment going on of the entire value system underlying the stock market and the economy. We've run for 40 years where we prioritized the interests of shareholders above everybody else. And obviously that was great for investors and it was good for the economy for a while. But when the pandemic struck, what did we see? We saw that our supply chains were so fragile that we couldn't make PPE when we needed to. We couldn't make Q-tips, and we can't process enough tests to know rapidly whether people have the virus or not. Our hospitals are struggling to adapt to a public health crisis. And so there, I think, is a legitimate need to go and ask questions about how we're going to organize the economy. And from an investor perspective, I think this is going to unleash a new period of growth because we've been running one way for so long that means the whole field is going to be open. And the test for these companies, and I think for Congress, is to keep what's great about the internet. And there is so much that we love while getting rid of the things that aren't attractive. And I think doing so will inevitably make these companies less profitable, but it will make them much more sustainable.
Roger, you've proposed pathways to regulation, and you say it's easy. I mean, what do you think should happen now? I mean, it's not just the House investigating various states, various federal agencies across the country, various countries around the world. What do you think should happen next?
Well, to be clear, I hope I didn't give anyone an impression I think this is easy, but I do think there are 4 really important paths to pursue. One is safety. One of the issues we have culturally is tech companies ship what is known as a minimally viable product. They basically put out the thing the minute it works and then let the customers sort out the problems. Well, at small scale, that's not a problem, but at the scale of these large giants, you can undermine democracy and public health by doing that. And it's happened repeatedly. We saw just yesterday another film, I guess it was a press conference that was broadcast onto Facebook and YouTube and other platforms that got something like 20 million views in a few hours before it was taken down. And it was entirely disinformation about COVID, and not new disinformation. It was repeating old disinformation. So that issue of safety is super, super important, and we have to address it. We have to deal with privacy. That is unbelievably hard and important. And one of the things I love about this hearing was how they drilled into data as one of the core issues for understanding, whether there's competition or not competition in a marketplace. That the notion that you don't have to have a monopoly based on the traditional metrics of an industrial economy to be dangerous, that even Apple, with absolute control of its own ecosystem, which doesn't do any real harm to the economy at all, it can still have anti-competitive behavior that should be addressed. And then the third issue, of course, is what I would call honesty. The industry of online advertising supported businesses is opaque. There's no ability to audit the number of users. There's no ability to audit what the ad views or the length of the views. And as a result, the industry is convinced that all the numbers are grossly overstated. If that's true, there are securities laws issues there related to revenue recognition. And then lastly, you have antitrust, enforcing competition. And what's weird about this, and the reason I think it's actually not easy, is that this is a different kind of industry. We need different approaches. And what I like about this hearing is that the antitrust subcommittee is showing a willingness to do really serious homework and to ask those questions in a forum where we can have that debate. And it's not going to happen quickly. But I think it's important that it happen. I think it'll be really good for the economy to get away from concentrated power.
Roger McNamee, so important to have your insights here today. And yes, as you mentioned, lawmakers much more prepared. My source was telling me voluminous amounts of documents were turned over, millions and millions of pages, as you mentioned, and lawmakers were more prepared. Roger McNamee, co-founder of Elevation Partners and an early investor in Facebook. Thank you so much for your insights there. Coming up, we're going to talk more about this hearing still underway. We're in the 5th hour of it. Apple CEO Tim Cook being questioned right now. We'll be right back with more. This is Bloomberg. Lawmakers continuing to question the CEOs of Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Facebook on Capitol Hill right now. The CEOs continuing to make the case that they all face competition themselves.
Services are about connection, and our business model is advertising, and we face intense competition in both.
We have fierce competition at the developer side and the customer side, which is essentially, it's so competitive, I would describe it as a street fight for market share in the smartphone business.
In the few categories which are commercial in nature, we see vigorous competition, be it travel, be it real estate.
We don't have a dominant share in any market or in any product category where we do business.
History shows that if we don't keep innovating, someone will replace every company here today.
For more, I want to bring in our Ben Brody, who covers tech lobbying in Washington, has been following this all day. Ben, the lawmakers were much more prepared. Oftentimes, the CEOs could not make the arguments that they clearly wanted to make. What did you make of the overall orchestration of this compared to hearings past?
Well, I think it was incredibly clear that they had done those months of preparation, all of the dozens of interviews that they did, the millions of documents that they obtained. And I was fascinated to see, almost like a deposition, these lawmakers, many of whom, were probably prosecutors or at least lawyers, reading Mark Zuckerberg's words back to him, reading the words of businesses that have worked with these companies and saying, I felt bullied by them, I felt threatened by them, and saying, what do you make of that? What did you mean by that? It was a totally different level from what you might have seen at Zuckerberg's first hearing, where there were a lot of questions, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you make your money? It just was totally different.
It was interesting to see the tack that Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos took on a number of occasions where he simply said, I can't promise that that rule wasn't violated at Amazon or by Amazon. What did you make of that?
I thought it was really fascinating, particularly on the issue of accessing the data of specific sellers when you're analyzing what products you're going to launch. That was the question that Cicilline floated again and again and again. He said that he thought the company might have lied about it. Basically, we know that it was the main thing that Bezos must have prepared for, and that was the best that he could offer. It was really striking to me, and I really wonder if that internal investigation either hasn't progressed very quickly that he's doing into employees allegedly having done that, if it hasn't progressed quickly, or if it's turning up stuff. It's really unclear, but I think the fact that he knew he couldn't go so far as to deny it was really telling.
Anti-conservative bias, definitely a concern among the Republicans. Lots of fire directed at Alphabet's Sundar Pichai and, of course, Mark Zuckerberg on that account. Tim Cook, somehow managed to avoid, in many ways, the toughest line of questioning. What was your take?
Well, anti-conservative bias was absolutely something that the Republicans really hammered on. They made this clear in the days leading up to the hearing. They made it clear in memos that I was able to obtain that they wanted to talk about this. First and foremost, it's President Donald Trump's first issue with these companies. And so, of course, they're going to go out there and kind of lead on this. And, of course, if they're focused on that, then they may be that's sort of a back way of saying we think the antitrust laws are fine and we don't have to change them. I wasn't surprised that Tim Cook wasn't hit so much on that, of course. He has always kind of ducked the anti-conservative bias issue, and he has a good working relationship with the White House. I was a little bit surprised how much he did duck some of the antitrust questions. There is no question that he probably gets the least criticism, but even here, with all the documents that they had, it's only now at the end of the hearing that they're really starting to train some of the questions on him. And I think in some ways that is definitely a win for him. He stayed out of the headlines a little bit, and some of the folks who aren't watching to the end might not have caught him at all.
So we're now in the third round of questioning. How much longer do you think this is going to go?
That is at the discretion of the chair, as the staff will remind us over and over again. At some point, they're probably not going to go past midnight. The lawmakers in the room, our reporter in the room said the lawmakers are dwindling. So even as they go into more rounds, it might not be the full hour and a half to ask a round. It might be 40 minutes. It might be 20 minutes. So it does seem to be wrapping up a little bit, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe there was one more round.
All right. Well, they did manage to get quite a few different rounds of questioning in, which is impressive given that all of these CEOs could have multi-day hearings of their own. Ben Brody for us in Washington. Ben, thank you so much for that update. We're continuing to listen in to these hearings. We will bring you the highlights as we have them coming up. We're going to get insight from Andrew Yang, an entrepreneur and former presidential candidate who's obviously got a very interesting perspective on the intersection between technology and politics. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. The antitrust hearing continuing on Capitol Hill at this very moment. We are in the fifth hour of questioning with House lawmakers grilling four big tech CEOs. Heated exchanges, and one company in particular compared to a drug dealer.
Here's how the apparel company described working with Amazon, and I quote, Amazon strings you along for a while because it feels so good to get that paycheck every week. And in the past, for lack of a better term, we called it Amazon heroin because you just kept going and you had to get your next fix, your next check. But at the end of the day, you find out that this person who was seemingly benefiting you, making you feel good, was just ultimately going to be your downfall, end quote. So, Mr. Bezos, this is one of your partners. Why on earth would they compare your company to a drug dealer?
Sir, I have great respect for you in this committee, but I completely disagree with that characterization. What we have done is create in the store a place. If you go back in time, we sold only our own inventory. It was a very controversial decision inside the company to invite third-party sellers to come into what is really our most valuable retail real estate, our product detail pages. We did that because we were convinced that it would be better for the consumer. It would be better for the customer
Bezos,
to have all of that selection. And I think we were right, and I think it's worked out well.
We're claiming my time. Unfortunately, this is one of, we're claiming my time, Mr. Bezos. This is one of many small companies that have told us during this year-long investigation that they were mistreated, abused, and tossed aside by Amazon.
Joining us now, Andrew Yang, former Democratic presidential candidate and an entrepreneur. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, you've got such an interesting vantage point, having worked in the tech industry and run a presidential campaign. What did you make of the lawmakers' lines of questioning here? They certainly were much more prepared than I believe some folks expected them to be.
Yeah, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Certainly, some of the lines of questioning did indicate that they had very specific topics they wanted to dig into. You just showed a clip of Amazon's treatment of its third-party sellers, and that has been a persistent complaint. There are many companies that have sold through Amazon and then felt like as soon as Amazon figured out that something was selling well, then they would find a way to privilege a house brand. So that came up. I wish that we talked a little bit more, a lot more, about the treatment of data by Facebook and Google in particular, but they were focused on antitrust issues and anti-competitive behavior on the part of these companies, which to me is a very large signal as to what may be coming down the pike where some of these tech companies are concerned in terms of antitrust actions.
On the subject of Bezos for a moment, this is the richest man in the world, his first time testifying before Congress, and also the owner of the Washington Post. Does that create an at all awkward dynamic between these lawmakers and Bezos, given perhaps a desire for coverage or positive coverage in the future?
Well, I think it's something we should look at very seriously, where if you're a tech company that dominates in a particular area, let's call it online retail, then it could be that you and your owners or principals should not necessarily be expanding into national media companies as one possibility. And right now we're in a media landscape where many of these media companies are struggling to retain profitability. So you're seeing any number of tech leaders buy flagship publications like the Washington Post or others. And so it's something that we should take a long look at, because you should not have media organs that you're questioning their editorial independence in this way.
So let's talk about the issues that you have raised with the data and the data collection. What are your biggest concerns about how these companies operate?
Well, right now, Facebook and Google in particular are generating tens of billions of dollars a year from our data, and we are not seeing a dime. And you think to yourself, well, how could this be? Because Facebook is free, Google is somewhat free, but they're monetizing our data, selling and reselling it. And Google recently announced that they're going to try and do away with third-party cookies throughout their sites, which would be an enormous change, and it would end up consolidating control of user data in Google's hands and make it very, very difficult for many third-party publishers to compete. And so we have to face facts that at this point, Facebook and Google have these data empires on the backs of our data. And unfortunately, our legislators are way, way behind the curve on this set of issues. It's negative not just on the economics, but also potentially on our autonomy and our democratic processes.
Do you think that Apple is in a different league here? When it comes to data, Apple has certainly positioned itself as a company that is very focused on privacy, the privacy and security of its users first and foremost.
Yeah, Apple has a different relationship with its customers and users. Where you elect to join the Apple walled garden, you generally have a paying subscriber type relationship. and so to the extent that they have our data, it's within an ecosystem that we actually opted into. And that's a different situation than is happening with Facebook and Google, in part because Facebook and Google monetize our data not just on their own sites, but through other partner sites as well. It's much more pervasive. So I do think Apple has a different relationship there, and it should be looked at with a different set of principles and concerns in mind.
Meantime, the biggest contentions about Apple today have been the App Store and the 30% cut that Apple takes from the vast majority of apps that make revenue in the App Store. You know, over the past couple of months, we've been speaking to folks, the CEO of Spotify, the CEO of Epic Games, which owns Fortnite, about their concerns here, as well as Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, who took Apple's side on this one. Let's take a listen to some of what they had to say.
Well, it's a duopoly. There are two companies together. They control 100% of the smartphone market, or something like 99.9%. And if you look in a lot of territories, Apple has the majority of revenue in many of these countries. Other countries, Google has majority of revenue, but it's impossible to look at a territory and say that in this place, Apple or Google is not a monopoly. They have monopoly, and they have business practices that only a monopoly could get away with.
Sometimes I have negative opinions about Apple being a little too much control over you, but I've thought about this one, this one that's going on right now with antitrust, and I actually take Apple's side on this one. 30% and giving you guarantees and protection and security in the apps that you could possibly download. When you look at what happened in the Android world, oh my gosh, yeah, I don't object to the 30% at all.
It's moving in the right direction, but we still have many, many steps to go before we would consider this an open and fair platform.
Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify, at the end there. Andrew, what do you make of that particular issue, given Apple's brand, given that there are 1.7 million apps in the App Store that maybe wouldn't have a place if Apple didn't run the gates and hold the keys the ways it does?
It's a tough one. It's a line drawing question, because clearly there's some toll that's appropriate, and you could look at 30% and say it's too high. No one would argue it's too low. I don't think. But there is something of a duopoly. It's true where, if you want to have access to this vast marketplace, you kind of have to play by Apple's rules, and Apple has set a 30% threshold. To me, the issue almost isn't even the toll they're taking, it is the control. There's a certain toll that would be appropriate. You could certainly argue for lower than 30%. But regardless of the toll they're taking, the other issue really is their ability to determine exposure in the App Store and who gets to participate in really what is one of the only ways to reach consumers.
Meantime, the president made his voice heard on this today, tweeting earlier, "If Congress doesn't bring fairness to big tech, which they should have done years ago, I will do it myself with executive orders." This is an interesting issue because all of these companies have been feeling it from both sides of the aisle. Obviously, Republicans have their concerns about anti-conservative bias, that these platforms, Facebook and Google, are taking down too much content. Liberals have the opposite concern, that these platforms are leaving too much up. How do you think the politics will impact what these companies are going to face over the next several years? Because obviously the House investigation is one thing, but they're facing investigations in several states from several different agencies across the country.
On this one, I kind of feel for the tech companies, because they're being put in a position where they have to sort of be the arbiters of what is proper types of content and communication. I was actually very amused by the Republican Congress person who asked, why are my emails going to spam? Is it anti-conservative bias? And then a Democratic congressperson was like, no, it happens to all of our emails because paid emails are generally regarded as kind of spammy. So to me, the politicization of this issue to me is unfortunate. I feel like conservatives who are crying bias, like a lot of these sites actually, in some ways, you could argue are actually very friendly to different types of content, including conservative content. The problem really is when some of this content skews into something that you could regard as hate speech or incitement to violence. And that's a real problem. And these tech companies have been put in position where they have to draw these lines, and folks are then going to be angry at whatever line they draw. So on this one, I think the tech companies' best approach would be to say, look, like, you're asking us to make these very, very difficult decisions. Maybe we should have some kind of other way to make these decisions beyond us, because whatever decision they make, someone's going to politicize it and attack it. So it might be in their interest to actually put their heads together with, for example, media companies, government, nonprofits, and come up with a more objective set of criteria that they could not be attacked on.
Meantime, you have both the president and Vice President Biden full speed ahead with their campaigns, with advertising on Facebook, advertising on YouTube. At the same time, just yesterday, this video about hydroxychloroquine being touted as a cure going viral, but then all of the platforms pulling it. How concerned are you about these platforms being undermined, being weaponized, and compromising yet another presidential election?
Well, I'm very concerned about election security, and it may not even be in the hands of the tech companies. I mean, you can see New York's having trouble counting mail-in ballots days and weeks after the fact. And this goes back to the issue about moderating content, where if you're promoting something that is not beneficial to public health or even harmful to public health, again, you're putting these platforms in a spot where you say, wait a minute, like we can't allow misinformation that's going to hurt the public health out there, and then someone will politicize that decision. So election security is one issue, disinformation is another issue, and these issues are unfortunately going to be with us for this election in November. I think we all want to have an outcome that actually just gets declared the night of, and that to me is going to be a big test for our democracy. Certainly, I hope that we have an election that everyone agrees on the result relatively quickly.
So as we look forward, do you think that these companies can do a better job managing their relationship with Washington?
You know, so here's, I mean, you know that, Emily, know this just about better than anyone. I mean, there's been a long period of time where technology just tried to just keep government at bay and say, like, look, like, you don't understand us, just leave us alone. And then they came a little bit later to say, well, I guess we should, like, invest in lobbyists. That seems like a good idea. But they've regarded government really as a source of friction to be circumvented. And that actually has to be the progression among tech companies, where they regard government as like a real, let's say, peer that needs to be engaged with, as opposed to someone you can just try and run circles around. Because the issues are growing in prominence. And unfortunately for these technology companies, they've gone from being able to do no wrong to having fewer and fewer political allies and friends, because it's becoming increasingly clear to many Americans that there have been excesses that could be very destructive to not just competitive landscapes, but also our democracy and our kids' mental health.
All right, Andrew Yang, always good to have your insights on the show, and especially good to have you today. Thank you so much for stopping by, Andrew Yang, entrepreneur and former presidential candidate. We're going to be talking much more about this hearing. It is still happening on Capitol Hill. We're going to be speaking with Sally Hubbard of the Open Markets Institute, former Assistant Attorney General in the state of New York, next. This is Bloomberg. Another antitrust expert calling for the derailing of these big tech monopolies is Sally Hubbard, the Director of Enforcement Strategy at the Open Markets Institute. She was also the former Assistant Attorney General in the state of New York. Take a listen to what she has to say.
I was really impressed at how strong and aggressive they were with their questioning. It was like night and day from past tech hearings we've seen. I know in the past it's felt like the tech CEOs were the ones in charge. But at this hearing, I really felt like it was the members of Congress who were running the show, and they had done their homework and they had the documents to back up what they were asking.
Now, you focused on antitrust during your time as Assistant Attorney General in New York. What is your take on how anti-competitive these companies are? Should they be broken up?
Yeah, my take is that they have been violating the antitrust laws for a long time without having any consequences. And that's through both anti-competitive acquisitions, like the acquisitions of competitive threats that we saw in the testimony today, evidence that Facebook had done that with Instagram and WhatsApp, and also through exclusionary conduct, which is when a giant uses their muscle to stop another company from being able to compete on the merits to be the best. And I've seen that time and time again. I've cited it for almost 5 years now, and I do believe there's rampant violation of the antitrust laws.
So then what kind of regulation would you like to see?
Well, there's a lot of different aspects of what I'd like to see. I'd like to see first strong cases brought against the tech companies. We have ongoing investigations by the state AGs and the FTC and DOJ. I would like those to resolve in strong cases, not weak settlements that we've seen in the past where you get a fine that doesn't mean anything, but actually probably a litigated situation to get the remedy that you need, which would be both structural breakups as well as monitoring of ongoing behavior to ensure that there's not this exclusionary conduct that violates the Sherman Act. And that's just the antitrust part. We also need privacy law, interoperability regulations, non-discrimination rules, transparency. There's a whole toolkit that needs to be used right now.
The president tweeted earlier today, if Congress doesn't bring fairness to big tech, which they should have done years ago, I will do it myself with executive orders. The president's tweets and posts themselves have been the subject of great controversy, and these companies, especially Facebook, are facing fire from both sides of the aisle, with Republicans saying they take down too much, Democrats say they don't take down enough. How does that change the risk here for these companies, given that they have lawmakers on all sides unhappy?
So there are some Republican lawmakers who really believe in antitrust enforcement and want to enforce the antitrust laws here legitimately. Then there are some that I really believe are just working the ref here and trying to make sure that they can keep pushing lies through social media by making these accusations that there's a liberal bias. If you look at any record of what is the top trending materials and content on any of these platforms, top 10 is right-wing media, right? So I really believe it's unfounded, but I do sympathize with their concern that we have too much concentrated control over information flow, and that the solution to that is antitrust enforcement. I don't actually believe that Donald Trump really wants antitrust enforcement. I think what he wants more than anything is to control Facebook rather than to break it up.
So after this, what happens next? Obviously, we've got the House investigation, but as you mentioned, investigations in various states at different federal agencies. What does the path forward look like from here?
I think very soon we need to see very aggressive complaints filed in court by the state AGs and the federal antitrust enforcers. I don't think that will be too far along. And then also some congressional reform would be ideal, but I think we'll see the antitrust cases sooner.
That said, how long could that reform take if it happens? I mean, are we looking at potentially several years of a protracted fight on this?
So antitrust litigation takes a long time. The Microsoft case took almost a decade by the time it was all resolved. But we ended up having a very dynamic competitive markets as a result of the enforcement. So antitrust enforcement is slower than actual legislation. Whether we can get legislation passed will depend a lot on what happens in the election in November.
Sally Hubbard there of the Open Markets Institute, and the hearing still underway. We've been listening in right now. Alphabet CEO Sundar Pichai being questioned. Earlier, we heard from Tim Cook talking about the App Store, talking about how many jobs it has created. He says the App Store has created 2 million jobs. Joining us to talk about what's next is Jennifer Rhee, our Bloomberg intelligence analyst. Jennifer, you've been doing a lot of work on this, and obviously the lawmakers came prepared today. But now that the House has and is soon to be wrapping up this hearing, they have more information. They have the responses from these CEOs about their biggest contentions. What do they do with that information next?
Well, now I think the hard work starts for them. They have said that they're going to put everything they've found from this investigation, which I think sort of culminated today, into a report. And the report is just to outline what their findings are, and then also to start to think about what should be done with respect to legislation, whether there should be new laws applying to these companies in the antitrust world or even beyond that in privacy, or some of the things that Sally Hubbard was just talking about, interoperability and transparency, or whether the laws that are currently on the books, are fine, or maybe just need some amendment. This is going to start the hard work, because I think where there is consensus on Capitol Hill that something should be done to curb the power of these companies, I'm not so sure there's an agreement about what that is.
Mark Zuckerberg made the case in his opening statements that regulation could have the potential of giving Chinese tech companies an advantage. He welcomes regulation, but certainly it depends on what kind of regulation. Did you get the sense that lawmakers care about the China issue at this point? They seem much more focused on competitiveness issues in the United States.
Yeah, I don't think that they do, and I really think that that's the way they should be thinking. That they shouldn't be thinking about, what this means vis-a-vis the Chinese companies, because essentially what the antitrust laws would say is that healthy competition is going to benefit our companies, the American companies, and that anti-competitive conduct doesn't. So what they should be doing is focusing on whether there's anti-competitive conduct that's happening here and whether the antitrust laws have been violated. And a defense to that is not, well, if you regulate us, you just might see Chinese companies take our place, or it could be detrimental to us and good for the Chinese. That's simply not a defense to anti-competitive conduct. So what they should be focused on is healthy competition in the market.
So as we close out, how would you evaluate the showing here of these four CEOs?
I think they were put in a really tough spot. The format just really didn't lend itself to them being able to really explain anything or getting an answer out. And I think it was set up to be that way. The politicians wanted to say their piece. They wanted to get some of these documents out that contradict what the CEOs said. And they really didn't give them a chance to explain themselves. So I don't think that it was a great showing for them. And I do think there are probably some explanations for some of those documents and some of the decision-making that the lawmakers were talking about and raising. But it doesn't really matter. I don't think at the end of the day, I think minds have been made up after this investigation has been done with respect to what's going to go into legislation. And certainly the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission have done thorough investigations themselves and are going to base any decision they make about enforcement actions on what they've seen and documents they've seen, and not on this hearing.
Right. And do you get the sense that they will be pursuing aggressive legislation based on the line of questioning and the tone of this hearing?
I do think so. I think what we'll see coming up is not just legislation, but also enforcement actions. And I think the enforcement actions would happen sooner than the legislation. The legislation, especially in antitrust, is going to take a long time. We don't know what will happen with the election and how that might change things. But I do think that the DOJ and even FTC may be ready pretty soon to bring a lawsuit in court against Google, maybe this year, Facebook maybe in the first quarter of next year, and then possibly Amazon and Apple, although I think it's less likely we'll see some aggressive enforcement action against those two latter companies. So I think that the next thing we'll see will be an enforcement action.
All right. Well, we'll be watching. Jennifer Rhee of Bloomberg Intelligence. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. And this hearing still underway on Capitol Hill, now going well into the evening, 9 p.m. on the East Coast. We're going into the 6th hour of questioning. We're going to continue to cover this. Stay tuned right here to Bloomberg Television. That's it for Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.
Public health measure, which I hope all of us would endorse. We don't want anybody, including the President of the United States, spreading